Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Pocket Economics, the podcast about the ideas that shape the key development challenges in the EBRD regions and beyond. It's special for two reasons. Firstly, we're recording this in front of a live audience amidst the magnificent surroundings of Pushkin House here in central London. Secondly, and even more importantly, our subject today is the great Soviet experiment, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, and the lessons that we can draw from the rise and fall of the USSR. We're taping this on November the 7th, 100 years to the day from the uprising which swept Lenin and his party to power. With me tonight, I have Sergei Guriev, a colleague who's the EBRD's chief economist, as well as lots of other achievements to his name. One Italian newspaper recently described him as one of Russia's most brilliant economists. Well, I'd argue he's probably the most brilliant of today's Russian economists. He probably wouldn't say that. I don't want him to blush like Lenin's red banner, so let's move quickly on and get the discussion started. Sergei, this is a podcast about ideas. Let's go to that central idea. Marxism Leninism, I mean, that was one heck of an idea.
That was a great idea. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for inviting us to discuss these big ideas here. Indeed, Bolsheviks decided to try this idea of collectivized command economy. And I would say that 74 years later, we saw that it didn't really work, didn't really outcompete other ideas, which we are committed to, market economics, where people decide for themselves what is better for themselves.
Why do you think they ever thought it would work?
Well, Tsarist economy was pretty inefficient, and other capitalist economists at that time also had major problems. And in particular, in Russia, you had monopolies, you had barriers to entry, you had exploitation of workers. All these statements, which we learned in school in Soviet Union, were actually correct, in the sense that workers were underpaid, entry to markets was actually limited, incorporating new businesses was hard, so Tsarist economy was not efficient. And on top of that, the government was reasonably corrupt, and there was a war, so people were searching for an alternative. And on top of that, of course, Russia had inefficient agriculture. Tsarist government tried to address that, and Stalin reform did deliver a bit, but it was too late.
Now, we should remember, of course, 100 years ago, today was the second of the revolutions of 1917. But when it came to this revolution, this second revolution, how revolutionary do you think was it?
So it was very revolutionary, although I wouldn't really call it a revolution. The big problem with Great October Socialist Revolution is that it was not a revolution, it was actually a coup d'etat. It was not really great because it did not bring prosperity, and wasn't even October because it happened in November. So that is one of the misnomers, and it's a typical story about Bolshevism, that you sell ideas that eventually do not deliver. And in some cases, people who sell those ideas already knew that situation would be different. But indeed, the situation was revolutionary in the sense that there was a threat of hunger, people were killed in the war, and even though Bolsheviks lost the elections to Constituent Assembly in cities, and especially in garrison cities, they did have a lot of support, and that eventually played out in their favor.
They had a lot of support, but do you think the vast majority of people understood what it really meant? What the economics that were going to be, that were going to unfold, what the political ideas were going to be?
Well, I would say that not everybody, especially young people with guns who supported Bolsheviks, understood what's going to happen. And not everybody had an economics degree among those people. And so they thought it's a great idea if you take something away from somebody who has it and take it for yourself. Not everybody understood the power of incentives, power of protecting private property. And in Russia, the problem was indeed that private property was only being created. And that, of course, undermined the trust in the system.
Let's take a look at some of the central tenets which really underpinned communism. And first of all, the abolition of private property. That was an amazing concept at that time.
Yes, you would think again, before the revolution, you would think, well, look, these landlords who don't work on the land, own the land, pretty much exploit the peasants. That's unfair. Those people who own the factories enjoy monopoly profits. They collude against the workers and against the customers. Trade policy was protecting them against foreign competition. So you see that things didn't really work. And so people said, maybe we should try something different. Take everything together and then see maybe it works out. In Voinovich's book about Chonkin, they describe these dilemmas faced by the chair of the kolkhoz, who said, initially when we brought everything together from everybody, it looked like a big chunk. It looked like it's a good idea. And then later on, this chairman of the kolkhoz was less excited about the fact that everybody tried to get things back, and productivity was not very high. But initially, to him, it looked like a great idea.
Because I mean, it's quite a major change. One day you own something. Even if you're not very well off, you've got some private property probably. Next moment, you've got nothing. I mean, to have that happening almost overnight is quite a mind-bending concept.
Yes, Bolsheviks actually did not expropriate the peasants right away. So initially, peasants expropriated the landlords, but the ultimate expropriation of the peasants themselves only happened 10 years later, actually in 1928, 29, 30. And that's where peasants tried to put a fight. When we had tens of thousands of riots, peasant riots in different parts of the country. But then at that point, Bolsheviks already had a major military force and crushed this resistance. But overall, indeed, it turned out that Bolsheviks were very smart by putting one part of public against the other. First, we expropriate the landlords, give land to peasants. Sounds like a great idea. Peasants seem to have something, although they used to have nothing. And then, indeed, it looked like it's just a redistribution policy, not unlike some leftist proposals we hear today in the West. But eventually, they eliminated private property altogether. And I think the end of that was indeed late 20s when collectivization started. That's when the agriculture, the backbone of Russian economy at that point, in late 20s, we had 85%, almost 90% of workers, of labor force being employed in agriculture. And that is when the complete abolition of private property happened.
So you've got that happening. You've got the abolition of markets, what might be described these days as capitalism. What was capitalism up to a point, and even with the restrictions of the way it unfolded in Russia. But you've got the abolition of markets.
That's correct. So indeed, people thought that, monopolized markets don't really work well. So how about we tell everybody what the prices should be? And again, initially, it didn't really work. And so that was a backtracking into a new economic policy. But then after all, it was also wiped out, and industrialization happened. And initially, it actually didn't work as well. Many people who studied first 5-year plan figured out that first 5-year plan was not actually implemented by far. So it was underperformed by far, and planning was not easy to do. And then again, eventually they had to backtrack a little bit. Second 5-year plan was less ambitious because it turned out that it does not really work as well as you would think it would. So prices should be formed by the market. Planners, I would even say planners with big computers like we have now, would not be able to accomplish price setting. But at that point, they didn't have computers. And actually, interestingly, they did pull off quite a feat. They planned 10,000 product categories, even though some people would estimate that in total, Soviet Union produced something like 20 million goods and services. So even at that point, this Gosplan could not plan everything. But 10,000 is quite a big number. And not surprisingly, they made mistakes, and they couldn't have delivered anyway because planning does not work by definition. But they tried.
So you've got this great experiment taking place, starting then, for the next few years after the revolution. But in order to do it, in a sense, you've also got the Soviet Union, the USSR, isolating itself from the rest of the world, from the global economy, saying we're going to do this in controlled conditions.
Exactly. And this is something that people don't fully understand, that Tsarist Russian economy was still part of the global economy. Soviet economy was initially completely isolated and then only started to reintegrate. And this reintegration was actually happening in a very fortunate environment for Soviet Union because the West was in a great recession in late 20s, beginning of 30s. So that was a lot of equipment that could be bought and brought into Soviet industry, and that's what Soviet planners did. Unfortunately, to pay for the industrial equipment, they had to export something, and since it was an agrarian economy, they could only export grain, and they didn't know how much grain peasants produced, so they decided to expropriate everything they could, which of course resulted in famine. Not only peasants died of famine, they also ate all bulls and horses, so productivity in agriculture was destroyed even more than people would have imagined. Actually, in late 1930s, still with all the tractors, mechanizations, with all the equipment, the tractive power of Russian agriculture was lower than in mid-20s, when all the tractive power was horses and bulls and cows, which were eaten up during the famine.
And then a few years into this experiment, do you think they recognize it's not really going the way they wanted to? Because you've got then Lenin's NEP, the new economic policy. And why do that?
Well, military communism did not actually deliver, and they also saw that peasants didn't like the idea that they're told to give up grain. And so they kind of postponed the complete abolition of land ownership. And that only happened afterwards in late 20s. And now this is actually a very good question why they abolished NEP itself. So some people would say that if NEP continued, maybe it would have worked. Maybe it's a little bit similar to what China did in 78 or early 80s.
Or Gorbachev in the mid-80s?
Gorbachev tried, but some things didn't work in Gorbachev's times, right? But in China, it kind of worked. They also started from almost military communism, almost starving population, and providing limited amount of incentives created agricultural boom. But then people would say that Stalin wanted to stay in control, and he actually used collectivization to destroy his rivals in Politburo. And also, altogether, the Politburo, the ruling Bolsheviks, first had an ideology, and second, they were afraid that NEP creates middle class, which may ask for political freedoms.
And that does seem to be an absolute contradiction to where the revolution started in 1917.
Absolutely. That was, the whole idea was to create property-less society, class-less society.
You mentioned Stalin, so let's talk a bit about Stalin and his impact. So Stalin said, we're 150 years behind the advanced countries. We must catch up in 10 years. Either we do it or they will crush us. And that's when we really get, isn't it, Stalin's economic policy through terror almost.
Yes, this is the main counter-argument. Some people would say that Stalin was an effective economic policymaker. This is actually very easy to reject with data, and you mentioned my op-ed in Financial Times. There I refer to our recent paper on Stalin's economic development, where we show that Stalin was effective in moving people from farm to factory, but he was also really bad in organizing factories and farms. Both farms and factories were underperforming in terms of efficiency and productivity. So on balance, Stalin's economy was not outperforming the Tsarist trend. So it was not more efficient than pre-1917 Russian economy. But then people would say, okay, we give you that, but Stalin's industrialization was not about efficiency. It was about building war economy to defeat Nazis. And that is, of course, an argument which is very hard to test because there is no simple counterfactual. You can talk about, say, Japan, which industrialized at the very same time and was outperforming Soviet Union. And it was kind of a similar level of development before, and then it was outperforming. Stalin never caught up to Japan. And Japan did not kill millions of people. Then another question is to what extent Stalin built the industry that would allow him to beat the Nazis. And the answer is no. Alone, of course, Soviet Union would not be able to beat Nazis, as Stalin himself said in 1943. He actually did say that if not for US productive capacity, we would not have won this war. We would not be able to win this war.
And also, you could argue that by the time industrialization and the 5-year plans really took off under Stalin and produced, even if they didn't produce sufficiently, they produced something, that the terror required to deliver them was so great that it became also counterproductive because there was a disruption to productivity through purges and all the other things that were happening.
That's correct. So basically the idea was in order to industrialize fast, Stalin wanted to keep consumption low. And occasionally he did not calculate things correctly, and so famine ensued, and the current estimate is something like 7 million people dying in the famine of 32-33. And then also to stay in control, he instrumented the Great Terror, which was killing about 800,000 people, mostly highly qualified, top human capital individuals. So if you think about this, how productive the economy can be if you kill the top million of human capital, and if you destroy 1 million top productivity agricultural families, households, that was decolocalization, where the top million of families was actually repressed. So these things cannot contribute to productivity. Of course, it's something which destroys growth. It's not something that creates growth.
So that's the first takeaway, isn't it? Industrialization through terror just doesn't work.
Well, it does. Industry was built, but other countries have built similar industries.
Does it work in the long term?
Well, in the long term, it's a good question, right? In the long term, other countries are doing better. And Japan, as I mentioned, already outperformed Russia in 1930s. And then, of course, after the World War II, Japan did even better. Now, there are two issues here. One issue is to build the industry in this mass production era, and that can get you to some level. So in that sense, Stalin did build modern industry. He did import modern equipment from the US and Germany. But then what happened after World War II, when he needed to move to the next stage of development, innovate, that is something when you need to get to higher levels of productivity, you need to provide some freedom, you need to provide competition, incentives, and that's what, of course, top-down industrialization cannot do.
And we'll come back to post-Second World War in just a second. Just a reminder, you're listening to a very special edition of Pocket Economics, recorded in front of a live audience at Pushkin House in London, and looking at the great Soviet experiment, the 1917 revolution and its aftermath. I'm Jonathan Charles. With me is the EBRD's chief economist, Sergei Guriev, and we're taping this episode 100 years to the very day after the Bolsheviks came to power, long enough perhaps to give us some historical perspective. Sergei, you mentioned just now the Second World War. What state then was the Soviet economy in by the time we get to 1945?
Well, Soviet economy was a war economy, and still, of course, it suffered major devastation and had to be rebuilt. Part of the rebuilding effort was aided by equipment that was taken from Germany and labor of German prisoners of war, but of course it suffered major blows. And then the rebuilding was pretty fast. Even though Stalin's Soviet Union was not part of Marshall's Plan, Soviet economy recovered and grew quite quickly after 1945.
And then we moved past Stalin, and we got Khrushchev, and the idea that perhaps there needs to be some catching up with the United States and Western Europe, that it can't be an experiment in isolation, what's going on in the Soviet Union.
Yes, Khrushchev did a number of things trying to catch up. Not everything was reasonable and rational. But one thing, which is, again, a parallel with today's China, was Khrushchev's attempt to reform the regional economies. So basically, Stalin's industry was built in a vertical way. Each region was specialized in one industry. Each town was one big enterprise. And Khrushchev thought that he needs to create competition between regions. And so he created so-called sovnarkhozy. So he moved power from Moscow-based ministries to regional-based sovnarkhozy, economic councils. And that didn't work. And that didn't work for two reasons. One was exactly the legacy of industrialization, where one region would be specializing in agriculture and the other one in ferrous metallurgy. It was impossible to compare which one is outperforming which one. That is very different from China, where in China, regions developed in such a way that each region was more or less self-sufficient and therefore comparable. And that this interregional competition really worked and continued to work until very recently. So, and then the second reason, of course, was Moscow-based bureaucrats didn't like that at all. And that's what eventually resulted in removing Khrushchev. And in that sense, we can say that some of these ideas were reasonable, but initial conditions were wrong, and political economy didn't work at all.
But there were some achievements during that period. One thinks of the space race, Sputnik, all the great achievements in space. Clearly, in that sense, there was a focus on some things, and the economy was delivering in some areas.
Absolutely, no. Of course, one of the things which was crucial was Khrushchev removed terror, which meant people asked for higher living standards. They did not necessarily get it right away, and indeed workers who protested against higher prices with stagnant wages were actually shot at in Novocherkassk. But then, in some cases, Khrushchev did deliver on raising living standards, and until now, people still live in those houses that are called Khrushchev's apartments. And the reason for that was the first time then people in that part of the world got individual family apartments.
You're moving away from communalkas.
Exactly.
So
You're
the
moving away from
economy seemed to be
communal
delivering in some ways.
Yeah, in some sense, economy was delivering, and then it was the excitement about not having to be afraid of everything, and it was some reconnect with the rest of the world.
And we move past Khrushchev, and you're into the Brezhnev area. And actually, though we always think of Brezhnev and stagnation, there was that period, wasn't there, a time of high oil prices, where people are getting more. It does look as though the economy is doing better than perhaps it really was. One thinks of, in China, I think they used to talk about the big three that the economy would provide. There was a big three, in a sense, in Russia at that point, wasn't there? People got an apartment to live in, they wanted a dacha, and they wanted a car. And
Absolutely.
The economy seemed to be able to, at least in Moscow and St. Petersburg, be able to provide those sort of things.
Yeah, at that point it was called Leningrad,
Yes,
still.
yep.
And indeed, not everybody had dacha, apartment, and car, but indeed, some people were getting that, and there was this sense of relative calm and indeed limited prosperity. Now, there are some measures which suggest that things were not as good. People that we know are people who did get access to those goods, people who lived in Moscow and so on, and probably people in intelligentsia were paid a little bit better. But there is now research which looks at other measures of well-being that show that it is in early 70s and late 70s where living standards actually stopped growing. So one of the measures, and this is research done by an American economist, Liz Brainerd, she looks at height of boys born in 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And basically, height is a good measure of quality of life. If your kids are not fed well, they grow up to shorter heights. And that actually shows that Moscow boys had the same height as American boys in 50s and 60s. And Moscow was not representative of Soviet Union, of course. But then in late 60s and early 70s, Moscow boys stopped getting taller. They started lagging behind American boys. And eventually that shows that this is when the growth and development kind of stopped. We have this biased picture because we always think about people who were better known, people from intelligentsia who did get better access to public goods. But overall, the living standards stopped growing. And macroeconomic estimates suggest that indeed 70s were when the growth has actually stopped. Oil money still paid for consumer goods for some people, but GDP stopped growing. GDP was growing between 0 and 1% a year.
Why do you think stagnation set in?
Well, that was a period in 1960s where government understood that either you have to shoot at workers or you have to deliver growth in incomes or at least some kind of consumption, some kind of consumer goods. And that's when reforms started to be discussed. And again, some kind of new economic policy, Deng Xiaoping kind of reforms. That's what's called Kosygin reform plans. And then oil was discovered. And then when oil is discovered, Brezhnev's government decided that things seem to work out and reforms are risky, unpredictable. Why should we try reforms? Let's try to continue with the status quo. So that was this addiction to oil that actually helped the government to delay talking about reforms.
Was there a sense at that point as well that the political class is exhausted? You've had this revolutionary attempt from 1917 onwards. You've got quite an old political class. people who've been fighting the good fight, as they would see it, for decade after decade. And you get the feeling they're sort of running out of steam, actually.
That's right. People who were running Soviet Union in 70s and 80s, these are people who started their careers under Stalin. And as they would refer to Minister Mikoyan, from Ilyich to Ilyich, without heart attack and paralysis, right? And these people were running the country for decades, and they thought things are kind of working out. And in that sense, indeed, it was interesting that indeed it took a younger person to start reforms. And I'm talking about Mikhail Gorbachev.
And he came through despite a system that had a lack of political competition in that sense.
Yes, so I actually asked him how that came about. And he said it was a coalition of the older guys, and I won't name them now, but some of these older guys decided that they needed change, and they understood that older guys cannot deliver change. And so they pretty much colluded with him and supported reforms. But even he, while we think of him as a great reformer, and he did many great things, most of all delivering certain political freedoms, he was not educated in economic deregulation, let's put it mildly. He was not able to figure out the consequences of, say, raising wages without deregulating prices. And so many things that he was doing pretty much failed because of lack of understanding of what economy is, how economy works, and also a lack of decisiveness of standing up to, say, military lobby, defense industry.
Because I think that's one of the interesting things, this question of not understanding how economies work. Because China was undergoing change at that point, starting to change, understanding there was going to have to be a role for free market economy of some sort within the communist system, and then managing the change, starting to manage it effectively. And yet Russia couldn't do it. And that parallel is always very striking.
This is a very important question. And indeed, there is now a debate to what extent Gorbachev understood reforms in China. And reforms in China indeed were moving in the same direction. Well, they started from a much lower level. So in a sense, what Deng Xiaoping was doing was a bit similar to new economic policy. And the level of development of China in late 70s was the same as development of Soviet Union, level of development of Soviet economy in 1920s. And interestingly, Deng Xiaoping was not necessarily a professor of economics, but he wanted to experiment. And actually, the main innovation, the household responsibility system, was not initially brought from top down, but actually emerged bottom up, where villagers got together and said, let's set this system of incentives. And turned out that they didn't die of hunger, which was the challenge at that point. And then other villagers started to copy. And then in regional conferences, they started to share this experience. And the central government said, it's a great idea. Let's do that. And again, this is kind of basic economics. But I think the main advantage of then was to allow experimentation, piloting different reforms in different parts of the economy and so on. Now, there is a great difference between Gorbachev and Deng. Deng did shoot protesters. Gorbachev did not, at least in Moscow. We still don't know who shot people in other parts of Soviet Union, but in Moscow, Gorbachev was not prepared to shoot. And in that sense, there was this feeling that Gorbachev does not have capacity to deliver on his commitments. And this is also a story why Soviet Union was falling apart. We economists, we would believe that regional leaders, Republican leaders, would be able to sit together and negotiate the redistribution of taxes, provision of public goods, and so on. And that actually happened. There was a number of meetings where regional leaders would come together at the same bargaining table and talked about this. But they didn't trust each other, and they definitely didn't trust the central government because they thought central government is too weak. Central government cannot enforce what it is promising. Again, on balance, I'm very happy that protesters were not shot at. Myself, maybe I've survived because of that. But that also was a huge difference between China and Soviet Union. Gorbachev was not the kind of leader who was willing or able to shoot at protests. Some people would say he wouldn't just be able to do that. But what also he was not able to do, he didn't have as much power over his own ministers, over Republican leaders. And when he came on board, he asked for numbers on defense budget, and he was told, no, this is secret, sorry. And only after about a year in power, he figured out that Soviet defense industry employed 10% of the whole labor force and was responsible for 60% of steel output, 75% of R&D, 20% of industrial output. So it was like a major economy within an economy. And of course, standing up to a defense sector, standing up to agricultural lobbies, standing up to energy lobby, this is something that Gorbachev either was not able or not willing or was afraid, I don't know, but he didn't do that.
And that defense thing is very interesting. Could I throw something else into the mix then and see what you think of it? That's another difference with China, that throughout the 80s, Russia is up against America spending very heavily as part of the Reagan plan on defense, a deliberate attempt almost to bankrupt the Soviet economy. And when you factor the expenditure, as you've just explained, into that, economic reform is bound to fail.
That's correct. And on top of that, Gorbachev creates this expectation that incomes will now go up, as they were supposed to go up in 70s and 80s. And the only way to do that is to borrow. Oil prices came down. So what do? You just borrow. And Gorbachev starts with a balanced budget, then oil prices go down, and budget deficit goes up to 10% of GDP. In the last year of Soviet Union, budget deficit was 30% of GDP, 3-0. Even in today's Venezuela, budget deficit is only 20% of GDP. So that was a fiscal disaster, but he could not stand up to the defense sector saying, we need to produce fewer tanks. We don't need as many tanks, because Americans have cruise missiles anyway. So, he couldn't stand up to other lobbies. He couldn't cut inefficient spending, and yet he had to deliver increasing consumer expenditure, increasing incomes to consumers. And this is where he made yet another mistake, which I mentioned before. If you increase wages, but you don't deregulate prices, shortages just explode. And then people stand in line instead of working. So in addition to inefficiencies related to regulating prices, you create inefficiencies related to making people stand in line instead of working and producing. And that's where economy collapsed completely.
And there we get to 74 years after the 1917 revolution, the October Revolution in November. It all comes to an end. The Soviet experiment comes to an end in that winter of 1991. But the legacy is still there, isn't it? We still feel it today. We're now all these years on from 1991. You can still see the legacy of that Soviet experiment.
I think there are several legacies, and part of that is in hardware. We still have the Soviet industry, which is indeed quite concentrated. We still have so-called monotowns, about 300 of them, where each town would have most of qualified jobs, most of skilled jobs in one firm, and not necessarily a productive and competitive firm. We also have polluting industry. Even though industrial production went down quite a bit and pollution went down quite a bit, in our own research in EBRD, we still show that in post-communist countries, pollution is still above pollution in comparable emerging markets. So that is also quite striking, because Bolsheviks' idea was about long-term, was about social benefits, not about those myopic capitalists that only care about their own pockets. And yet, it was the Soviet industry that polluted and destroyed the environment rather than the market economies. So these legacies are important. But I think the more important legacies are the kind of software, the values, the culture, the attitudes, the suspicion to markets,
cynicism and corruption. How does that fit
cynicism
into
and
it?
corruption. That's very true. So if you regulate prices, of course, black markets appear. And so people understand that not obeying the law, circumventing the rules, is not just a luxury, it's a necessity. And it's becoming okay to cheat, it's becoming okay to bribe, and that, of course, creates this bad equilibrium where people don't take the law as something which is delivering good things. Moreover, given that the state, even in Brezhnev years, was quite repressive, people also treat the state and the police and the courts. Well, you can call those things courts. But they treat state apparatus as an enemy, which of course creates incentives to circumvent the law.
Right. I think it's time we involve our audience. As we've been saying, we're here live recording at Pushkin House. We have an audience in front of us of many people, and we'd like your questions. What we would ask you to do is wait for the microphone to come around. If you put up your hand if you want to ask a question, the microphone will come around. Please say who you are, ask your question, and Sergei will answer it, or attempt to answer it. Who would like to ask the first question?
So, how would you describe the current developments in Russia in terms of economy?
And could I ask your name? Sorry.
Oleg Korzun.
Thank you. Today we unveiled our forecast. So this is public information. I'm not going to move markets now. That came out in Financial Times and all other media and Bloomberg and Reuters. And basically our forecast is upgrading Russian economic growth to 1.8% in 2017, 1.7% in 2018, on the back of higher oil prices and growth in the global economy, in particular in Europe and China. Overall, we believe that Russia could have been growing at a faster rate if Russia implemented reforms, deregulating, privatizing, opening up, reintegrating in the global economy, fighting corruption, improving business climate, and so on and so forth. But without those reforms, and this is our status quo scenario, our baseline scenario, we assume that Russian economy will grow between 1% and 2% per year, depending on the oil prices.
I think someone in the front row wanted to ask a question. Yes, lady here, and if you could say who you are, that'd be great.
Hi, my name is Olga. Thank you so much for wonderful monologue and
a monologue interrupted by irritating questions. Is that it?
Yeah. Interview. I'm trying to follow the events in Russia this year, how the revolution, the anniversary is covered. Doesn't look like it's really fashionable to do it back there, and a lot of events are happening here in London, even though probably should be the other way around. So the question is, and obviously you would know that the 7th of November is no longer a holiday. It used to be a public holiday, now we're celebrating something else. So we're kind of forgetting about our history. Whether or not communism was the right thing to do, it's another question, but is it really the right thing to do, just kind of dump all these years and say, okay, it's not fashionable anymore, we just, yeah.
That's a big philosophical question. Question about lack of memory. The joke goes that when you buy iPhone 10, the most important question is about getting the right amount of memory. I think lack of memory is always a problem, and we want to have understanding of history, exactly not to repeat the past mistakes. And I think by now, since many of the archives were opened in 1990s, some of them were closed again, but then in 1990s, many of these archives were copied, and you can go to certain libraries in the UK, and especially in the US, and especially in Hoover Institution at Stanford, and you can learn a lot of stuff about Russian history. So many things, unfortunately, are very different from what Soviet history textbooks would teach you. And people who don't look for real historical research don't know many things. So people don't fully understand that Russia did have a republic and an election. And then, indeed, this election was lost by Bolsheviks. And so Bolsheviks simply crushed the Constituent Assembly. So this is something which is not fully understood in Russian public debate. So revolution was not actually the day of November 7. The main revolution was taking over Constituent Assembly. And we still have monuments to this Matros Zhelezniak who did that. Another revolution was indeed collectivization, 1928. This is when last private property of agricultural land was wiped out, and so on and so forth. So this kind of historical knowledge, unfortunately, is not broadly known and is not in history textbooks, which I think is the most important thing. But if you want to know things about Soviet history, now you can. There are many books being published, mostly here. You can have all kinds of stories. So people in the West interviewed survivors and wrote stories about Stalin's Politburo, about normal Soviet life, about the last generation of Soviet Union, about Lenin's brain, for that matter. One of the top historians in the West wrote a book called Lenin's Brain and Other Tales from Archives. And so he told a story how Lenin's brain was taken out of Lenin. There was a debate what to do with that. And they decided to study it, but they didn't have research capacity in place. So they sent it to Germany, to Kaiser Institute, and the top professor said, my results show that Lenin was either a genius or a crazy person. And so Stalin said, no, we take it back and we store it until we have the right researchers to study it. So we still don't have an answer.
And of course, there is the old joke, which is Russia is a country with an unpredictable past.
That's right.
Yeah, and I think that still holds probably true today. But there is a serious point behind that as well, Sergei, to follow up on that question, which is actually many countries have very complex and complicated histories, particularly if they've lived through very unusual circumstances, which you could argue that period from 1917 to 1991 was, or other countries have had also similar issues. And it's always very difficult to evaluate how to deal with it in the current world, for the current generation, how to look back on it.
That's a great question, Jonathan. And in this country, you also have episodes of history that are probably nothing to be proud of.
No, I think here, in the United Kingdom, people would look back on the colonial era and not quite sure how to handle it.
Yeah. I won't comment on recent electoral outcomes too, but this is not my job, luckily. But seriously, I think this is a very important question, and I think one of the painful lessons from this is you really need to tackle those issues. Otherwise, people try to rationalize the past. So how do you come to terms with the idea that the government simply killed 7 million people in this famine? How can you come to terms with the Great Terror, where people were just killed? How do you come to terms with the Katyn disaster? So all these crimes, people try to rationalize it and come out with kinds of stories that Stalin had some rationale, Stalin had some plan. Couldn't be the case that we as a country were run by this person who was really bad, let's put it mildly. And people try to overcome this cognitive dissonance with stories which make no sense once you actually look at data, look at evidence, figure out what has actually happened. And I think it is true that we need to address the history and have the honest conversation. Does not really mean that you have to put in jail 80-year-old people, 100-year-old people, but you have to name those who committed crimes. And in principle, if you read books published here, you have the names. But that is not broadly discussed in Russia now.
Other questions, if you want to put up your hand. Okay, we'll go to the gentleman there first. If you could give your name, that would be fantastic.
Hi, Atanas Denov. It's interesting the parallels you drew with China, but you also mentioned Japan pre-Stalin and after Stalin. Why is that? I mean, Japan was very collectivist, but not really a communist planned economy of that sense. What are the economic parallels with Japan?
Right, thank you. Very good question. So I mentioned Japan exactly because they didn't do central planning. So basically the question is, can we find a counterfactual, a country which was at a similar level of development and was growing at the same time, was industrializing at the same time, without abolishing private property, without abolishing markets, also preparing for a war, and ending up on the wrong side of the war. But still, if you actually look at comparators, U.S. was way ahead of Russia in terms of industrial development, in terms of living standards, something like 100 years ahead. West European countries were like 30 or 40 years ahead of Russia. Japan was at the same level of development. And so comparing Japanese development and Soviet development is instructive. And actually many Western historians would say when you compare Stalin's industrialization to something, Japan sounds like a big enough country, but also poor enough country to compare Stalin's Soviet Union to Japan. China at that point was much poorer, of course, and was not industrializing. So it's a good comparator. Yeah.
And we have a lady in the second row here as well.
Hi, thank you again for your lovely conversation. So my name is Sarah. So originally I'm from Russia, and I moved a lot from one town to another. So my question about movement, to be honest. So many people, once they graduated from either university or high schools, they had a lift or just an appearance of a lift to move from one step to another. They have a located job. So, and at the moment in Russia we don't have that possibility. So that's why people just live in the universities, live in college. They even found the job, or they used to be on the market without money, without resources, and only thanks to their parents they can move. So my question actually, what do you think? Is such planning part of the planning economic was good, and it was more the positive moment of Bolshevism, or it has disadvantages?
That's a good question, actually, about whether, because there were possibly positive things in these things. Sergei?
Yeah, we'll talk about two positive things. And before talking about education, I would say gender empowerment was also a very important thing. And for example, election of 1917, which I already mentioned, was the first major election with universal suffrage, including women. Not at that point, the United States didn't have that, and Switzerland only allowed women to vote in 1970s. Right? So I see a Swiss.
We do have a Swiss representative in the audience, actually.
Yeah.
They make very fine
Thank you
clocks.
for allowing women to vote.
Yes.
Still, you can actually trace the differences between East Germany and West Germany in that sense. And West Germany was an advanced country in many ways, but East Germany did a better job in integrating women in labor force. And you can talk about double burden, you can talk about glass ceiling, all kinds of stuff, but yet that was a major developmental move in integrating women into labor force. And the other thing is, of course, education. Soviet Union, for all kinds of reasons, believed in better education and indeed funded universal basic education for everybody and built universities. And indeed, that was done also for war economy reasons as well. But in general, indeed, everybody benefited, and literacy rates were very high for the level of development Soviet Union was at. Now, when we think that Soviet Union was at par with the United States, it was not at par in terms of income per capita. It was 3 times as poor as the United States in terms of income per capita, or maybe more if you take into account all kinds of quality issues. But in terms of education, Soviet Union did have 100% literacy. Now, the interesting part is, I'm glad you're bringing this up, what happened after Soviet Union. Actually, education expanded big time. So now we have twice as many universities and twice as many students. Now, quality of these universities is not necessarily very high, and it cannot be high because to teach something, you need to have good professors, and where do you get good professors if you expand by 100% in 10 years? Professors are precious commodity. It takes a lot of time to prepare a good professor. So hopefully.
I think you might be a bit biased here, but it's probably true.
Yeah. But that, of course, the quality issue is there, but quantity is really expanded. And if you actually look at returns to education, you still see that people who go through higher education get higher wages in Russia. There is a substantial material return to education. In that sense, market likes current universities as well. And also, if you look at life satisfaction of people, if you ask people, how happy are you? Better educated people, even in today's Russia, are happier. So it's not like this education is completely waste of time. It's not. It could have been better, and I hope it will be better. But it is there. It is there. So mobility, of course, is something which is very much needed. And I myself have done research on internal labor mobility, and I fully agree with you. It would be great if people moved more in Russia, across regions. And exactly for the reason that there are monotowns where you only have one kinds of jobs, and this job may not be there for generations to come, so you need to find another profession. So all kinds of issues are there, but I won't really say it's black and white.
Now, a question in the front row here from Craig Kennedy.
I'd like to come back to 1917, but to sort of really widen the aperture and look at it from a very broad historical focus. The question is a simple and very difficult one at the same time. Was October or November 1917 inevitable or not? But I want to think about it not in terms of Bolshevism and Marxism, but rather in terms of a different conceptualization, and that is the restoration of the strong state in Russia. Because some historians would argue that, in fact, 1917, or the Bolshevik coup, was a restoration of the strong, centralized, absolutist state that began to erode with the great reforms of the 1860s. That we had a highly centralized state with an in-serf peasantry and pretty much all of the major economic rents under the control of the state up until the loss of the Crimean War. That was such a great shock to the system that they realized they needed to modernize. But in modernizing, of course, they opened up Pandora's box because it created space for the emergence of a middle class, a technocratically trained class, and they soon began to clamor for their own political influence and created civil society, and that the revolutions of 1905 and more importantly February 1917 really were the middle class demanding political enfranchisement from the strong, withering state. But that all gets turned around with the Bolsheviks in the late 20s in particular. So coming back to this question, was it inevitable, or maybe more broadly, as some people argue, can Russia really only be governed by a strong state?
Thank you very much, Craig. I understand that the great Russian writer Boris Akunin was here on some occasion, and he was speaking about his history series, and he strongly believes that indeed since Tatar and Mongol state, Russian government system is indeed about centralized, strong state. And Russia is probably one of the few survivors of Genghis Khan's legacy, basically, and still is pursuing this approach to how to run things. And indeed, he would fully agree with you. To what extent it is inevitable? I think we can ask this question, for example, with regard to Korea or Germany, where you go back to, 1950 and 60, and you say South Korea, North Korea, same country. And then somehow they diverge. And South Korea was not initially very democratic. But now it is. Several presidents are in jail for corruption. Protesters can actually demand freedoms and honesty and accountability. And it's not a coincidence that these political institutions also managed to transform Korean economy, which was initially based on this centralized, industrial, investment-based growth model, into post-industrial, knowledge-based, innovation-based model. For that development approach, you need freedom, competition, all this middle-class stuff you were talking about. And initially, you would think Koreans cannot do that. And North Koreans would definitely say so. But you see some divergence here. So it's not about some genetic issue. It's about whether the government that benefits from staying in control can convince everybody else that this is the model that can only work in our country. And so far, as you rightly said, many people believe that this is what Russia can only do. But we also see that there are some Russians outside of Russia who live in market economy and kind of seem to integrate pretty well.
And thrive. Yes, lady here we'll get you a microphone in the second row.
Hi, hello, my name's Bandini Chichia. My question to you is, I'm just amazed at how the uptake communism had outside of Russia, basically, without listing too many countries, even saying Italy or in Spain, and it really got a following. And I guess for a long period of time, the West was almost worried about the red wave and about, it taking over their form of government. So could you just tell us a little bit about what was so attractive about communism that it got sort of pushed out? Or was there a conscious effort by the Bolsheviks to sell it? Or did it just happen by itself? Did the world need something different?
The romanticism of communism.
Yes. Well, in a sense, even though Bolsheviks were very anti-church, now they're not any longer. The Russian Communist Party is very Christian now again. But it was about certain Christian ideals, about equal opportunity, about access, about fairness. And not everybody knew how things actually turned out within the Soviet Union. And Soviet Union did a great job of disinformation. We recently had Anne Applebaum in EBRD presenting her Red Famine book. And basically, Anne Applebaum is also a disinformation researcher who says that it's not only about today's disinformation work, but it's also the Soviet times disinformation work that was very effective. But I think in general, capitalism faced major problems in 1930s in particular. And I'll give you an example of Turkey. When Atatürk started his work, he was very much anti-Bolshevik. But in mid-30s, he said, we need to learn how they industrialize when the capitalist world is in recession, in depression. And so he actually brought advisors from Soviet Union to learn, and he did follow some of those models. Not as far, not nearly as far as advisors would tell him to do, but still he was willing to learn because it was a big contrast between Soviet industrialization and Great Depression. Indians also wanted to learn. As you rightly said, South European also wanted to learn. So, sure, it looked like a great idea until it was no more, right? And that is also something which, in the end of the day, you see that was a great experiment, but it couldn't pay for itself, and it lost out in competition. And initially, it was based on terror. We invest, we develop, because people are happy to give up everything they have for this great idea. And if they are not happy, we'll take it by force. And then, without terror, it completely fell apart because people were not supposed to sacrifice everything, and it was not enough to satisfy their needs. So it turns out that economic incentives really function, really work, and planning economy does not.
Yes, gentleman, just there.
Charles, so I have a question regarding, can I ask you to play devil's advocate for a minute and defend the idea of a planned economy and what might be the benefits of implementing that? I don't know, not now in this modern context, but what could be the benefits of a planned economy and what could be learned from the Soviet experiment on what did actually work and what could be used today?
So the initial motivation for planning economy, there are two motivations. One motivation is correct externalities and stop abuse of monopoly power, right? So that's the idea. The monopolistic capitalism was bad because it was about exploitation by capitalists of everybody else, of workers, of consumers, and so on. So planners would be able to set the fair prices. So if we think about producer of bread charging you too much for a loaf of bread, that's unfair. So how about we charge you less? Okay? Sounds like a productive idea. We know that it results in shortages and in some cases in famines, right? The other externality you can imagine is environment. All these capitalists destroy public goods, including environment. Bad. Let's do planning. As I said, data are not consistent with this conjecture that planners know how to take care of the environment. And the other motivation was this industrialization approach. So that's actually a frontier of economic thought of 1920s. Two Russian economists, Feldman and Preobrazhensky, put together a two-sector model, quantitative two-sector model. saying that we need to industrialize and we need to pay for this. So how do we pay for this? We need to take grain from peasants. And that's what the model actually tells you. So if you believe in forced industrialization, you need to do that. They advocated price scissors, meaning pretty much a tax on agricultural surplus. But Stalin, again, as Jonathan rightly said, believed that we need to do it fast. And he decided to move faster, and so he decided to take 100% tax, and in some cases more than 100% tax. And of course, that backfired in terms of economic outcomes as well. But these initial ideas, in principle, in theory, is something that can work. But interestingly, the empirical evidence is that they didn't. Because indeed, Soviet Union did not protect consumers. And one simple piece of evidence is people never wanted to leave from Western Germany to Eastern Germany. The wall was built to prevent the flow of people in the other direction. So probably living standards were not as high in East Berlin. So maybe bread was cheap, but something was wrong about that consumer model. So also the industry was built in this gigantomania way. So you would build one big gas producing company, one big metal producing company, and so on. And of course, this is one of the legacies we have now. Competition is not very easy to promote when you have those huge firms, one firm in each industry. So, and then environment, as I said, was not actually taken care of.
It's probably time for one last question, if there is one, if anybody wishes to ask a final question. Okay, how about the gentleman at the back has been waiting a bit of time.
Werner. The next election in Russia in 2018, so next year, let's say that you are running for presidency, you get elected. You have 5 years to change the country. What would be the 3 points on which you would focus during your mandate?
I have an exact answer to your question, but I currently am working in EBRD and my contract doesn't allow me to run for president next year. That's literally true. I'm not supposed to interfere in political life of countries of operation.
So I will take one other last question. If that lady, there's a lady here who had her hand up if she wants to ask her question. In the third row there, yes. Hopefully it's not about asking Sergei to stand for political office, is it?
Oh, no. My name is Anna, and thank you, Sergei, for coming here and talking to us today. You mentioned corruption a couple of times, and it seems like this is one of the features of Russian economy for the longest time. So as a scholar who studies Tsarist economy, Soviet economy, and post-Soviet economy, have you been able to compare the impact that corruption had at different stages? And if it is so, like, what is your conclusion on that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a very good question, and the simple answer is no. Unfortunately, we don't have good comparable measures of Soviet and post-Soviet levels of corruption. That's actually, unfortunately, what it is. There is a broad feeling that corruption went up after dissolution of Soviet Union. I think it's very hard to say because corruption was just different under Soviet Union. I mentioned all these connections, blood, bribes, black markets. This is also not law-obedient behavior. But indeed, we probably should say that leaders of Soviet Union had much less wealth than some of the richest Russians today. And I highly recommend this paper by Philippe Novakmet. It's actually being presented in 2 weeks in EBRD. Philippe Novakmet, Thomas Piketty, and Gabriel Zuckman. Gabriel is now very much quoted because he's a top authority on offshore wealth. But this paper is actually about inequality and in income and wealth in the last 100 years in Russia. And basically they're saying that Soviet Union decreased inequality, and then the inequality went back up after Soviet times. But of course they have to recognize that even if you and I have the same income in Soviet Union, that doesn't mean that we are equal. What matters is who gets to get to the right shop and spend this income at regulated prices or at black market prices. And in that sense, those measures, unfortunately, are not comparable. But it is true, what is coming very strongly from this paper is that Russia now is one of the champions in terms of storing its wealth offshore. And these people are saying that these are the very top 0.0001% of Russians who have about $1 trillion stored offshore. And Russia, in that sense, is one of the big champions in that dimension. So inequality and corruption are a big issue in Russia.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Sergei. Thank you also to everyone here at Pushkin House this evening. Thank you to the EBRD production team. Whether you're with us tonight here in this room or listening to this as a podcast, you can share your thoughts about the great Soviet experiment. You can do that by contacting us at EBRD on Twitter or Facebook. You can also download previous episodes of Pocket Economics via iTunes, SoundCloud, or at ebrd.com/podcast. This has been our first live recording in front of an audience, but I'm sure it won't be our last. There are many more to come. Until next time, goodbye.
Thank you very much.